in a global economy, and maybe I read too many right-wing things, but I'm just thinking about the U.S. With their qualitative easing, which I think maybe they're not going to be doing, quantitative easing, they're not going to be doing as much, and they're, printing all this money, and the debt that they have accrued. I'm just wondering how you invest at Nicola based on what's going on in the States.
Okay, so that's a fair fundamental question. So this is just to restate the question, because the U.S. has been using quantitative easing, which is a nice word of saying the central bank printed a lot of money, and because they have relatively high debt to GDP,
Right.
Why would they effectively be a good long-term bet from an investment perspective?
Well, no, I just think that what they're doing is maybe wrong, and how that's going to affect the global economy and how you would invest accordingly here.
Okay, so it's an interesting question. I'm not sure I quite agree with it, because it's an interesting the way the market looks at it. So at the beginning of this last year, the central bank was buying $80 billion a month of basically government debt and mortgages. And since that time, as of next month, they're basically going to be at zero. In that time frame, even though they added that debt to their marketplace, and even though they were no longer buyers of bonds, which normally would make the price of bonds, the yield go up, the yield in fact dropped. So the rest of the private world basically couldn't get enough of U.S. government bonds, and that's why the price went up and the yield went down. So the U.S. economy, notwithstanding the fact that it added debt, maybe one way of looking at it in the developed world perspective is it's as they say, the least dirty shirt. Okay, so compared to the debt to GDP, for instance, in Japan, or the demographics issues and the unemployment issues and the structural issues in Europe, the U.S. is by far the most dynamic economy in the developed world, and in addition has far, far better demographics. Better demographics in Canada, anywhere in Europe, and certainly pretty well anywhere in the developed part of Asia, and that includes China. So when we look at the U.S., and the other thing that's interesting is the U.S. has a lot of other major factors that are a plus. It now has something like 15 of the largest 20 global corporations in the world are American again, which wasn't the case 10 years ago. And they still have 17 of the top 20 universities in the world in terms of R&D and research by independent standards when universities are measured. So when you start to look at the U.S. in fact has a lot of specific attractive features. I agree, politically, they're completely dysfunctional. I can't imagine how much better their economy might be if they actually had a functioning Congress. It would be a huge improvement. And eventually, it's interesting that they have to deal with their debt, but so do a lot of other countries around the world have to deal with their debt issues. If you think about it, Canada has been incredibly disciplined on its debt. Our debt to GDP is far better than the U.S. Our deficit is far lower than the U.S. in terms of our national economy. But notwithstanding that, our dollar has dropped almost 12% in the last 12 months alone, simply because commodity prices have dropped. That's a plus for the U.S., but it's a negative for us. So our view is diversification. We're certainly not saying, let's go put all our money in the U.S. at all, but it's been a good decision for our clients, for us to have made sure that we had exposure to that marketplace. And I don't think that dynamic for the U.S. is going to diminish a lot over the next few years.
So do you think they'll continue to prop their economy up the way they're doing it? And
no, their deficit, to be fair, was $1.5 trillion on an annual basis 5 years ago, and is now $500 billion. It's not that it's tiny, but compared to the size of their economy, they've cut their deficit by 2/3. You can't say that about too many European countries, and you certainly can't say that about Japan. So essentially, they have less in relative terms of a debt problem than a lot of other places do. So I'm not saying they don't have an issue, it's just not as big an issue as other places.